One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this episode we bring you a conversation with journalist and author Amy McQuire, recorded as part of our webinar series in February. This was recorded live on Wednesday the 17th of February, and things may have changed since recording. G'day everyone, welcome. I can see all our attendees piling up on the side there. I think we've got about 1,000 people registered for today's webinar. Thanks so much for coming along. We really appreciate it. I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our 2021 webinar series. I'd like to begin by stating that Canberra is Ngunnawal country. That's where I live and work, and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today and preface this discussion with a warning that some of the discussion may touch on some distressing issues, and a warning that we might also mention the names of deceased people. So I'm delighted to introduce journalist and author Amy McQuire. Amy is a Darumbal and South Sea Islander woman from Rockhampton, and she was the National Indigenous Times' first female editor and also their first Aboriginal editor. She's previously worked at NITV, New Matilda, BuzzFeed, and has written for a variety of other publications, including Meanjin, The Griffith Review, The New York Times, and Guardian Australia. In 2020, she was pretty busy. She was undertaking a PhD at the University of Queensland, and if that wasn't enough, she was also the recipient of the Australia Institute's Writer in Residence program in 2020, and she came and worked with us for a couple of weeks on her book. Her upcoming book, The Water Behind Us, is a journalistic investigation into the wrongful conviction for murder of Aboriginal man Kevin Henry. And the book deals with some complex intersections of how race, gender, class, and Aboriginality interact with the law. She's also the co-host of the investigative podcast Curtain about that case of Kevin Henry. And when the Black Lives Matter protest came to global prominence last year, Amy wrote a particularly searing piece for the Saturday paper about Aboriginal deaths in custody, titled "There Cannot Be 432 Victims and No Perpetrators." And I'm sure many of you read that at the time. So welcome, Amy. Thank you for joining us. I'm almost just exhausted reciting that list of your accomplishments. You had such a good year last year. We really appreciate your time today. I did want to kick off with a question about that book that you came to us for a couple of weeks to keep writing. How did you come across the story of Kevin Henry, and what has compelled you to pursue his case so doggedly, I guess?
Well, it was actually, I'd heard about his case from a cousin in Rockhampton at the time who was his advocate, and I'd heard about it a year before we started looking into it. And there had always been, and when I heard about it, I just asked around Rocky in the local, Aboriginal population, just local mob around, and immediately there were questions raised about his innocence. So this was a story that was talked about by mob in Rockhampton, but wasn't known outside of Rocky or even had been forgotten in Rocky. And the reason it had been forgotten, not only because Kevin Henry is an Aboriginal man, but also the victim was an Aboriginal woman named Linda. And within basically a week of her death, the story had fallen off the front page. It had been spoken about as if it was a lifestyle crime. It was seen as a black-on-black crime. So there were ways that the dehumanisation of the victim, but also the alleged perpetrator, had an effect that people largely did not care, but Aboriginal community in Rockhampton cared. And one person who I particularly started to think, we have to look into this case, was my dad, because he'd been an Aboriginal prison guard at Capricornia Correctional Centre for the majority of my life, since I was 1 to about, I think I was 20-something when he left. And about 10 years into, he was on duty the night Kevin had been convicted, and he always thought, well, that's a weird case. The guards at the time had actually spoken about it, who'd sat in on the trial, said, well, we don't know about this one.
Yeah.
But then 10 years later, Kevin had actually told Dad one time that he was innocent and that a police officer had held a gun to his head and forced him to confess. And so that's how I sort of started to think, well, why hasn't anyone really looked into this case before? And then I did an interview with Martin Hodgson, who's a UN human rights lawyer based in Bega, whose focus is wrongful convictions. And I told him, like, maybe you should look into this case. And within a month, he'd found evidence that, you know, supported Kevin's claims of innocence. So it really just started there, and it had that snowball effect where once we found that early evidence, it just continued to build up. And, you know, we have such a compelling case of innocence for Kevin, and nothing we have found that even, you know, supports his guilt or the court or the police's version of events.
Yeah. And so before we kind of get into maybe some of the more systemic issues, for people who aren't familiar with the case, can you just give us a little summary, starting with the murder of Linda and kind of, I guess, where we find things now for Kevin Henry?
Yeah, and it was quite a distressing case. So I might not go into details specifically about what happened out of respect for her family. But basically, in 1991, in September, she was found in the Fitzroy River. It was a really horrendous crime. So within 5 days of finding her body, 4 people had been charged with murder. There was 3 women who'd been charged in relation to an assault that had been perpetrated against Linda before she died, and they ended up getting grievous bodily harm. And there's a lot of evidence to support that they did perpetrate that assault. But the person who got the largest sentence was Kevin Henry, and he was given a life sentence for murder. But when we started to look into the case, we realized that there was no actual evidence to support that conviction.
Yeah.
And in fact, that there was a confession, which wasn't really a confession. And a lot of Australians or just regular people will think, well, how do you confess to a crime that you didn't commit? Martin Hodgson had actually done a lot of work on death penalty cases in America, a lot of cases over in the Middle East, in Italy, all over the place where he knew that the reality of false confessions. So he was actually able to look at Kevin's confession and find all of the holes in that confession. And so one of the problems was that it was a joint trial and Kevin didn't have proper adequate defense. And so when even you just look at the trial transcripts, he should have never been convicted in the first place. There was no evidence at all. Yeah. So it's a very complicated case, and you have to sort of crouch it in the context of what was happening on the riverbank, but also what happened in Rockhampton and the entire history of police interactions with Aboriginal mob and the history of intergenerational trauma. So that's why it becomes quite a complicated and sensitive story to talk about in that sense. And that was one of the hard things in approaching this story, was thinking, how do you write about this case in ways that supports Kevin's claims but also does not compound the violence against the victim, which had already been perpetrated, had been compounded not only in the police investigation but also in the courts, where she was largely just left out, and it was just the wounds of her body reinscribed. So it's very hard to sort of talk about these issues in ways that do not further compound this already horrendous violence against the victim and also against Kevin. He was traumatized within the justice system, not just in this case, but throughout his whole life, from when he was a young kid being locked up in juvenile detention to now being, even now after he's been out, like the effects that 20-something years of wrongful incarceration has had on him, and he's currently trying to heal from that.
Yeah, so I think that kind of brings us to some of those systemic issues, but you were talking about the history of police violence with mob in Rockhampton. But, for white people, we're often taught, that if you're ever in trouble, go to the police, and that's who you trust, and they're in authority and they will help you. But obviously that's really not the experience of Aboriginal people in this country at all. And there's really good reasons for that history of distrust. Yeah. Can you just kind of talk about some of those systemic issues that come up through that case or that became apparent for you while you were looking into Kevin's case? Definitely just the space in which they were, first of all, living at the time. So
the crime actually happened in Tanuba House, which was a local Aboriginal drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre. And it was a safe place for the most part, because mob would go there largely to be safe from the eyes of police. They were over-surveilled in Rockhampton and they were looked down upon. And I feel like, a lot of like non-Indigenous people in Rockhampton have no idea about, the experiences of policing by Aboriginal people on the riverbank. It was a very different space. The space in which Linda died was seen as sort of this degenerate space, and so her body was seen as not worthy of mourning or worthy of justice. And so there was very early on those problems around over-surveillance in relation to policing, but also police brutality, in the sense that a lot of mob I've talked to in relation to this story around that time, we're talking about, I think there's this assumption that blackfellas shouldn't be believed and that police should be believed in these cases. But so many mob just had experiences of police brutality, whether like telephone book being used against them, like actual, these really horrendous cases, but they'd just never been believed. And this was the time, it was in 1991, it was just after the Royal Commission. And in this case, Linda, the victim, her brother had died a horrendous death in custody and was one of the 99 cases investigated by the Royal Commission. And so that brings up a whole other host of issues because his was a violent death in custody as well. Mm-hmm. And there was no justice for his death. And it was one of the most high profile. So there are all these issues in relation to it. The other thing was when Kevin was picked up, and largely we just think they went around and tried to find any blackfella to get for this crime because it was just such a shoddy investigation. When they brought him in, he asked 3 times for a lawyer and he was each time refused. So that's a key indicator of a false confession, whether there's a lawyer present. While they were interviewing him, he's sort of just agreeing to a lot of questions. He's very confused about what's happening. So there's these issues around gratuitous concurrence. There's also issues which we know in wrongful confessions. You're just agreeing because you don't really understand what's happening, but you just want to leave because you didn't do this crime. Yeah. And then there was the central allegation. Yeah, and then there was an allegation, which I believe Kevin, because he said it and he's maintained it, that he was, a gun was put to his head and forced him to confess. So, there's so many issues because then I can start talking about the courts and how the defense lawyer just did not stand up for Kevin and the jury. Because when you go through the transcripts, there is nothing really about Kevin other than this confession. And so what I'm thinking, and I wasn't in the courtroom and we can't ask the jury, obviously, but what I think is that they just heard these details of violence in the riverbank and they just saw this, black fella and thought, well, he must have done it. That's how I think sometimes the most simple explanations of what happened.
A neat little box.
Yeah. So, I'm probably going all over the place, but in Kevin's case, it's such a complicated story, but there's so many elements of it that speak to the wider problems with the justice system and how it treats Aboriginal people. But it goes back to that central theme, I think, of not caring about the lives of Aboriginal women or Aboriginal men, but particularly Aboriginal women. I feel like that is what this case is all about. That Linda was never respected enough for the media did not care enough to pursue justice for her. And ultimately, she never got true justice because the man who was convicted is innocent. And there's just a snowball effect of, this further violence being perpetrated against not just only him, but his community who have always believed in his innocence. So I think it comes down to that central element of Aboriginal women not being respected and not being valued by this justice system that is overwhelmingly violent towards us. And I just wanted to bring up another issue around the Royal Commission is that it did not, and this is a critique made by a lot of Aboriginal women like Professor Megan Davis, is that it did not look adequately at gender. Mm-hmm. A lot of Aboriginal women at the time, like Judy Atkinson, a lot of people around that time were talking about the fact that we actually have to look at family violence and also police brutality specifically against Aboriginal women, and that was never brought up. And that was an issue that I felt kept coming out because Linda died in the same year as that the Royal Commission came out, and yet there was silence around her death and so many other Aboriginal women who died around that time and which we're still, wanting justice for. And not just Aboriginal women, Barrowville children died in 1991, so there was, and that's a continuing fight for justice. And that's similar issues around police inadequacy. They blamed the community. They said they were looking into them for child abuse. They just didn't care enough to go and actually find the people who did it. As well.
In those situations, gets the benefit of the doubt, and it's never...
No, never. No, well, Aboriginal people are just never believed.
Yeah.
Around that time, there was also I think it was Heriop did this report into police brutality all around the country. When you read that report, you hear the voices of Aboriginal mob, particularly like young people as well, were talking about their experiences of police brutality. And, you know, like the fact we had this report, I was just reading back the report and thinking of the fact it happened in the same year that Linda died. You know, like blackfellas are just not believed when they talk about experiences of police brutality, and that's something that's continual today.
Yeah, and I think that maybe brings us back to your Saturday paper article from last year. So when George Floyd was killed and there was that awful video footage that everyone was kind of able to witness, and it really took the Black Lives Matter protest to another level, and they went global. And I was really struck at the time by your Saturday paper article of, you know, there can't be more than 430 Black deaths in custody and no perpetrators. And at the time you wrote that no police officer had ever been convicted of an Aboriginal death in custody. I know that there's been a couple of police officers charged in relation in the last couple of years, but is that still the case? No one's ever been convicted?
Yes, I mean, we've had a couple of, there have been charges laid, and we're currently waiting on the trials of Mr. Walker in Yuendumu and Miss Clark in Geraldton. And also there was there's a correctional officer who's been charged with manslaughter over Dwayne Johnston in Lismore. But yeah, I mean, from what, there has never been conviction. And I think that's the problem when we talk a lot, is that there's an obscuring of the perpetrator or the violence that has been enacted against Aboriginal people in this system. And a lot of Aboriginal mob have been working to make that violence visible so people see it. And a big problem in relation to the way coronial inquests or the language that death in custodies are spoken of is this idea of natural causes. So it's seen as if Aboriginal mob are dying at natural causes. So that automatically obscures and stops any calls for accountability. When you look at these cases that they talk about natural causes, you see that actually, you know, there are actual layers of violence that are being perpetrated against Aboriginal mob from the health system and the justice system, but that intersection of both. And so these aren't just cases of natural causes. And actually, when I was down in the Australia Institute, I was just looking back into the case of Mulrunji Doomadgee, and I was reading the early reporting. And the early reporting, there was actually a death in custody in the same day, I think, as Mulrunji, which, you know, was seen as a natural cause. But also Mulrunji's death was first reported as a natural cause, as if it was some sort of, you know, he just died and they called an ambulance. So it spoke to this idea of benevolence on behalf of police. And automatically there was attempts to stop questions and also frame the very valid and justifiable questions of Palm Islanders who actually were listening to their own witnesses who were resisting police versions of events very early on. They were framing these very valid questions from Black witnesses as irrational and violent and evidence of the tensions that were building on Palm Island at the time. So you see the way that Black witnesses are slandered automatically in ways that obscure the accountability of police, not just police, health professionals, correctional officers, all of these people who are involved in this system that is ultimately as a whole violent towards our people, and yet we're blamed for that violence. You know, that's what really said to me. Mulrunji's blamed, and also he was tarred as violent when really mob at the scene said, no, he wasn't being a public nuisance. She just locked him up because he was Black and walking down the street. Yeah,
I remember I was in Parliament House at the time of his death, and that kind of narrative about the violence and riots and all of that did begin really early, and it really does obscure from the actual what happened in that death, and kind of just takes it all off in a different direction, and means that the accountability was so hard to come by because, you know, everyone's distracted over here with something else. But you're right about that, the undermining of the Black witnesses and the stories that we were hearing from Palm Island at the time, really, really got obscured or minimised or undermined, I guess. And so at that time, I also thought in that article where you talked a lot about how there is a huge history of Black resistance and trying to tell those stories, but that it's been really hard for the Aboriginal community to give those deaths in custody the prominence that we gave to George Floyd's death and to the deaths that we see in America. So I wonder if you can just speak a little bit to that difficulty and that history and how important it is for Australia. You know, obviously it's good that we support the Black Lives Matter movement and oppose that police violence in America, but we're not really doing enough to address our own situation.
Yeah, and I think people assume about the fact that, you know, when the video footage was shot and was beamed around the world, showing George Floyd being, you know, it was a murder on camera. The footage was so shocking, it sort of catapulted it to public attention and international outrage. But we have also had similar cases in which CCTV footage has shown horrendous brutality perpetrated against Aboriginal mob who've died in custody. And it just does never gain the prominence that it deserves. And I think, and largely that footage has been released because of the concerted effort and campaigning of families who've taken on that burden. And it's a traumatic thing. Like, if you think about, you know, what if it was if your sister or your loved one had died, would you want that footage to be out there? Because after 10 years, do you still want that footage to be out there? They're actually really troubling questions, and almost like this horrendous burden that Aboriginal families have to take in order just to push Australia to care. And that this footage, it's almost like they don't care, because I think they're seeing Aboriginal bodies in a certain way and they're seeing the violence that's being enacted. They might not see it as violence, first of all. You know, when I look at the footage that come out, Mr. Briscoe up in Alice Springs, he had done nothing wrong. He'd been arrested for being drunk in public. That's all he'd done. He wasn't arrested, first of all. He was put into the watch house. But when I saw that footage, I'm like, how does this case not change everything? Because that to me was brutal. So I'm thinking, you know, Australians look at that case and think, well, that violence against, you know, a black body, that's where he is supposed to be. That's inevitable. That's legitimized violence. It's not even violence to them. And I think that's part of the problem. They're not seeing this violence, and they're not, first of all, they're not seeing Aboriginal mob as human, or they're seeing us as, you know, being locked up is not just inevitable but legitimate. You know, like that's where we're supposed to be, and that's where we're supposed to die, in a sense. So I think that's part of the problem, because that's what I was thinking. I'm like, we have CCTV footage. It's not a question of getting the CCTV footage released. Yeah. We have a lot of footage of police brutality that supports the version of events of black witnesses, and yet black witnesses are still not believed. When you look at the injuries of Mulrunji's body, that supports all of the black witnesses' accounts over that of Chris Hurley, who is implicated in his death. So who do you believe? It's amazing how it's supposed to be just the burden on the black witnesses so heavy compared to that on like white witnesses, like police officers. Yeah. So it's just unbelievable, because I just think, how can you look at that footage and not care? And Miss Stu, like there is violence in this footage. And I also don't think the family should have to have that violence out there for people to care. You know, I don't think Australians should have to it seems to me almost like entertainment in a sense sometimes. You know, because it can be an extra burden when you've gone all that time, and then Australians are still debating about whether there should be charges or there should be further calls for justice. That to me is just, you know, another form of violence in itself, I think, to put that burden on families who are already grieving. Yeah,
and that would be incredibly distressing, as you say, to have that footage out there. You know, the internet never forgets, and it would just be always there to re-traumatise you. Another thing I wanted to pick up on from that Saturday, I think it was in the Saturday paper article, you talked about another death of Ms. Marr and the custody notification service that operates in New South Wales. I believe that was one of the calls of the Royal Commission. It was implemented in New South Wales, but not everywhere else. And you talked about how in the story of her death, the focus really became on the fact that nobody called to that custody notification service, instead of, to me, the issue is, well, why do you need that to keep an eye on police? Why can't we just trust police to look after the welfare of Aboriginal people? And obviously that's a measure to help ensure that accountability. And I believe that was perhaps one of the first deaths since that custody notification service came in. But it really doesn't get to that actual original problem that Aboriginal people aren't safe in custody. And that's the reason for the service.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I heard, because obviously the custody notification service is really important and it should be funded. But it was just...
Before we get into it, it is they did withdraw funding or reduce the funding for it, and now, they accept donations to try and make up that shortfall to keep the service going. So, sorry, continue.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. But I just had a lot of problems with that story. It's something, me and Martin would always talk about, just because I felt like first of all, in relation to the CNS, the police, it was just a matter of police procedure. The police actually weren't required to call the CNS at all because she had not been arrested. Yeah. First of all, there were so many questions that should have been raised very early on. So I think it comes back to what are the questions that we have to actually be asking. I felt like that CNS narrative dominated so much that it totally obscured. And these were questions being asked of the family. So in a protest, like about, I think it was a week after or a month after Miss Ma's death, like her mother actually raised these questions. Well, why was my daughter in a watch house? She hadn't done anything wrong. Why didn't they call me? Because I was just at home and I was a safe place where they could have taken her and she would still be alive today. And those two questions were fundamental, I thought. So, and there were questions being asked by the family who knew. And what came out of the inquest, was that she was being approached for a bail breach, but she hadn't breached bail. And they've just picked her up for being intoxicated. She wasn't intoxicated. They've claimed that she had HIV. She didn't have HIV, and that affected the way they dealt with her. They mimicked her in really highly racialized images, and then they said that they didn't know she was Aboriginal, even though her family is known as being an Aboriginal family in that area. So there are all this successive wave of violent events that was perpetrated against Miss Ma that never came out, and the effect of that was that they changed the requirements. So the CNS, even if you're not being arrested, they still have to call the legal. So that most likely would not have saved Miss Ma's life. Mm. You know what I mean? Like there were all these other things that happened to her. And first of all, she should never have been in custody. The police, if they picked her up, they could have taken her to her mother's house. And that was actually what they should have done, which was on their own requirements. And so there are all these things that I think it's that thing around the obscuring of the violence again, and not naming it as violent. And so that sort of stops any further calls for or momentum for accountability. But her family are still grieving. Her family is still mourning. They don't have her here today. And she has 4 children. And I know her mother has, it's just absolutely, outrageous. I feel like even black media, all of mainstream media failed Miss Ma. But all other cases in which we're not asking the right questions, and not getting to the heart of what's actually happening, I don't know. It's just, it's such an outrage. And the fact that even after last year, we're still having death in custodies, and yet we still don't have Australians looking at it and going, well, actually, this is incredibly wrong. You don't need to know the numbers. You don't need to have 400 something deaths. All you have to do is look at one death in custody case and see how violent it is. And you see all of the problems with what is actually happening and being perpetrated against Aboriginal people in ways that aren't perpetrated against non-Indigenous people at all. Yeah. They're highly racialized.
So we might go now to questions from the audience. So just a reminder to everyone that you can type out a question for Amy. I think we've got about 500 people on this webinar with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll pick up on a question here from Melina Smith, which I think talks about a point that you just made, Amy. She asks, what elements do you think the Australian media have in enabling and normalising ugly stereotypes for Indigenous groups?
I think they've had such a huge role because media have been used to secure the settler colonial projects against Aboriginal people. So these representations of Aboriginal mob, men as violent savages, women as disposable, without agency, without love, who aren't loved or don't love. Those are images that have been perpetrated from colonial times, and they're reborn in current representations. So it's the media actually re-perpetrating it. So I think it's the media as a structure that is violent towards Aboriginal mob, because I say violent because they have real-time consequences. And we saw that. The biggest example of that is the anti-intervention. That's just a case in point of how lying about Aboriginal men, slandering them as pedophiles. And also there was this lie that wasn't really picked up at the time that Aboriginal women did not care about children, that we were passive, that we needed people to speak for us. That justified this really horrendous political strategy of racism. It was racist. It was a racist policy, and you had to name it as that. So it's not just the media is this innocent it's actually complicit in this violence and the justification of the violence. And I'm starting to think, I'm starting to think it's the structure, and it's even just the way of journalism, the way we do journalism, that can be the problem. The methods of journalism, I think, can go against Aboriginal ways of storytelling and knowing, which I think, you can have like a perfectly fine piece that fits, every standard of journalism. There's nothing wrong with it by those standards, but when it's applied to Aboriginal mob, you see it change. I don't know how to explain it properly, but I see it more as like that institution, that system, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, I often reflect that Parliament is, very partisan because it's an adversarial system. It's an opposition against a government, and question time is very much set up that way, in the same way that a courtroom is. But journalism in some ways thrives on conflict and having,
But the authority, the knowers, are the white.
Yeah.
The ones who are perpetrating violence. You know what I mean? And we're supposed to be objective. But there's nothing objective. I mean, we know that's a lie. Everyone knows that's a lie.
So there's another question here that kind of touches on this, and Kate McMahon has asked, how do you look after yourself and your well-being, considering the amount of trauma that you report on and the ongoing trauma of colonisation? And I'm sure that's not just an issue for you, but many journalists who report in these spaces.
Definitely. And Kate's awesome because she's from Dart Centre for trauma. So I've learned a lot from Kate and Dart Centre in strategies to do that. I also just find strength in mob. I don't know if that's even, but I actually find strength in a lot of the stories. So there'll be very traumatic stories, but there are also stories of strength and resistance. So I actually get a lot of strength from Black witnesses themselves, who are just, some of the stories are just so multiple layers of violence, and yet there's these acts of resistance. And I think that's what is that foundation, I think, because it's also the foundation that keeps you going. You know what I mean? Like, you don't, like, particularly in relation to Kevin, like, there's no way we could have ever abandoned Kevin's story because Kevin was still sitting in jail while we were doing it. And so it was very important for us to get out. But even now, we're trying to get him exonerated. We don't have that luxury of forgetting about this because this is like happening right now. But I get that strength from Kevin. He's the most strongest person I've ever met. The ways he has resisted not only 29 years of wrongful incarceration, but throughout his whole life is just absolutely phenomenal. So I think that's the key for me anyway, is through that. So.
And we did have someone ask if Kevin's not exonerated yet, can you just explain why he's now out of jail?
Yeah, so we actually had to work a lot for the parole process. So it was important for us because he was actually, we were really worried about him while he was in prison because it is a violent place, but he was sick. Like, he's middle-aged now. He went in when he was 22. Not just, so the trauma of that incarceration, but also just we were worried about his health. Mm-hmm. And so our first step was actually working with his lawyers to try and get him parole. And that was a really hard process. I probably can't exactly say exactly why, but that will come out in due time. But so it was very important for us to focus on parole. In relation to exoneration, it's actually the first time in Queensland that we'll have a case like this. So we have to petition the governor. And so we're working on that now. It's going to be quite intense because it's literally the first time. I just wanted to say also there's a man down in Adelaide prison, Derek Bromley, who served over 33 years in prison for a crime he did not do. And so we're waiting to see what's happening next with his case. But if you look into Derek Bromley's case, it's an absolute outrage. It's connected to Colin Menock, who was the dodgy forensic pathologist down in South Australia. And I think all eyes should be on both Derek Bromley and Kevin Henry's cases, because when you look at their cases, you just see how screwed up the justice system is in relation to Aboriginal mob. And I just feel like Derek Bromley is not talked about enough. If you look into that case, you'll just see how absolutely disgusting it is. And he's still in jail. He hasn't gotten parole yet. And he's been there for 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jefferson DeMayo has asked, how has Kevin's case impacted the community and the justice system? And has there been any progress towards reform within the police justice system?
It has, in the sense that stuff we can't really talk about that's ongoing. But I think just in relation to the community, because, there was this is a really amazing thing, because Kevin's from Woori. Everyone in Woori and Rocky knew that Kevin was innocent. But it's so hard to know because we haven't had a case like this. You don't know where to go, really. I mean, where would you even know how to start? The only reason we're eligible because Martin had so much experience overseas and working in overseas cases. So I think just in the sense that the community has also seen their, hopes realised, and Kevin's mother was literally just waiting for the day he would be released. And that was something that was really important. His father passed away while he was still incarcerated, which was really sad. Yeah. So I think just having Kevin back in community and being a part of community has been really important. But yeah, we're hoping to continue that fight this year and just keep building momentum for his case.
Next question is from Nellie Samandari. She asks, can you please talk a little bit more about intergenerational trauma and its impact on systemic oppression?
Well, I'd say it's one of the key issues because it's not, people sort of talk about it in simple terms, but it actually has real, physiological, psychological, biological effects that has continued from colonization. But it's not just, I think people just think, this is the problem with Australia. They think everything happened in the past. It didn't just happen in the past. It's actually, there's been violence that's been reborn and continued. But a lot of people focus on, violence in an interpersonal sense. It's because this state-sanctioned violence, this violence that's legitimated by Australia, is not seen. But that's the perpetrator and the continual perpetrator of this trauma, a lot of Aboriginal mobs. So it's key to a lot of, it's central to a lot of issues that they're seeing today, which mob are continually blamed for. And that's why a lot of mob talk about healing and ways we can heal. And I think justice and truth-telling is tied up in that as well.
The next question is from Dan Feely, and he says, last night on the news I saw footage of a police officer repeatedly throw an Aboriginal man's head into a wall. I didn't see that, but that sounds awful, Dan. The judge decided that it was reasonable force. How is justice achieved in such a case? It's a really big question, Dan.
Yeah, I don't know unless I was able to see the case, but I think that's the horrendous part of it, is it is seen as reasonable force and justified. And often, I think even one of the things was asked, it's about police investigating police. And when these incidents happen, police are very quick and the media machine is very quick to come out and say, well, no, it was justified. Or there are all these lines even before an investigation has been had. So I think the public pressure is really important as well, to say, well, actually, there's something wrong here. But they often try to justify it by claiming, Aboriginal mob as criminal automatically. As soon as you're even in an interaction with police, you're seen almost as criminal. And you're seen as violent. So there's those different ways that people are seeing it. So I think that's one of the problems, the issues around police investigating police and police being let off and police being seen as the primary authorities, which is a huge problem in Australia, I think.
Amy, you did mention to me that you're contributing to another book called Black Witness. Do you just want to talk a little bit about that and what people might find in that book?
Yeah, so Black Witness is actually the book that I've got to get out in this year. So it's just a collection of essays, sort of journalism, but past issues I've reported on around that theme of the Black Witness and around those themes of why the Black Witness is not believed in all these different cases, but why you should believe the Black Witness. And it sort of come from this piece I did in Meanjin, where I was sort of looking around the issue of when Kerry Ann Kennelly and Joe Hildebrand were on Channel 7, and basically, this continual racist diatribe, which wasn't even new, about, Invasion Day protesters shouldn't protest, they should care about, violence in Aboriginal communities, which is totally, ridiculous, because a lot of the mob who were protesting also worked directly in relation to these issues. So it wasn't actually about them caring, it's about them getting on their high horse. But it was sort of just seeing the differences in the black and white witness and how the white witness positions themselves as war correspondents reporting on a war that they are not a part of. And so they zone us into certain spaces. And that's why there's so much focus on remote Australia as this hub of, violence and savagery, when that is not the truth at all. And they don't need mob speaking for them. Some of the most amazing protest movements we've had in history, like the Wakefield Walk-Off, happened in remote Australia. So there's techniques that the white witness is using in ways to position themselves as almost like war correspondents in ways that obscure the complicity that the media, but also Australia, has in the current situation. So that's like it on a broad level, just bringing up those themes.
But it's an interesting point, and I think it happens in other issues as well. But that idea of, well, you can't talk or care about this thing unless you also care about this other thing over there. But how rare would it be for the media to be reporting on, violence in remote communities as its own issue?
Well, they do it in a way that silences Aboriginal. It's a silencing tactic. We saw that in so many ways, but it becomes an unsafe space for a lot of Aboriginal women to speak on violence. We have so many Aboriginal women working in this area who've been ignored. Annie Judy Atkinson, Hannah McGlade, Professor Marlene Longbottom, so many people that I'm probably even missing out, who've continued, and even just in community working on a grassroots level, who are working in relation to this space, and yet their efforts are totally silenced, and they're silenced when we talk about solutions in debates that become political ways to further violence against our people. And I mentioned the intervention again, like that's the key example of it. So it becomes very unsafe for us to speak about violence because it's going to be seized upon for these political agendas. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a bigger issue even than that. I think it's, this political agenda to further these really horrendous policies that are continually perpetrated against our people.
Yeah. The next question is from Hannah McGlade. Says that agree with the media analysis and we need more diversity urgently to raise the cases and issues, and asks, Amy, have you any views about law schools and how we can get them to commit in practice to anti-racism in the law?
Oh, I'm not sure about that, eh? That's something I don't think I'm an expert in at all. So my focus has largely been just on, it's not even been on mainstream media, it's been on building up Black media in order to be able to ask these questions but tell these stories, but also like complicated issues about violence and how we report on it in ways that don't further dehumanize Aboriginal mob. But I think that's been the key part. I think there's, there are issues in relation to the law that aren't being talked about. And I think one of those is, innocence, wrongful convictions, but also just, like inadequate defense that happens in every community. And you talk to any Black fella and they'll talk about the fact they were told to plead guilty. Like that's such a common story.
Yeah.
So I think we're not even, I don't know, looking at law in a different way.
Yeah. So not that you're necessarily a legal expert, but on your podcast, Curtin, you talk to Martin about some of those issues. And I think you say they come up throughout the podcast. But yeah, the inadequate defence, the lack of resources that go to Aboriginal legal services and things like that, where, it isn't justice if, you can't access it properly and if people are being told to plead and those kinds of things. What are some of those other issues that come up, not in the necessarily the policing end of things, but once things are already in train and you're within that justice system and within the courts? Can you tell us about some of those issues that came up or that you've discussed in your podcast?
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things was around definitely around the defence issue, because we found like that was what happened in every part of it. And Kevin didn't even have a proper appeal. He wasn't given a proper appeal at all because he had the same defence lawyer. So he didn't, at the very first part, he didn't have access to justice. The other thing I found, but this might be just in relation to Kevin's case, was that, the appeal process, there was not, after that appeal process went through and it was an adequate appeal, there was very few mechanisms afterwards. But I think also I'm just looking at, I was always comparing sort of what happened to Kevin in the context of Barraville as well, because I'd reported a lot on Barraville, and just seeing how there were similar issues. So the Barraville children were never allowed a joint trial. That impacted the ability for a successful conviction, or it impacted the way that trial was run. The families always wanted that joint trial. In Kevin's case, there was a joint trial of 4 Aboriginal alleged defendants, and that actually impacted Kevin's case. So I just see differences in the way, and a lot of people say, oh, well, it's an equal law. It's actually not. When you look at so many different instances, it's just not. Like Aboriginal victims in particular are treated completely differently, and we see that in so many different cases. So I don't even look at it, it's about the victim, I think, and I think that's not often focused on enough as well, how it impacts that course of the course for justice.
Yeah. Graham Turvey has asked, could you shed any light on what recommendations of the Royal Commission are not being used to prevent deaths in custody in 2021?
Well, I think the majority of the recommendations just have not been implemented at all. And so that was still a fight that's still ongoing. And I think sometimes we do have to look back into the Royal Commission and consider what was also the gaps that came out of the Royal Commission, because I think things have moved on that we're finding out more and more, particularly about the violence in the justice system. And I say that in the context of the health system and how it intersects with justice, that I don't think when I read those past cases was brought out as much as it should have been in that original Royal Commission. So I think, that's been the key thing. And I think this year, this April, is the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Nothing has changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. But a lot of those cases that you look at, they could have happened today, which is really incredibly sad. So you see that there hasn't been those changes. And in relation to like a more personal level, my dad was at the jail in Rockhampton pretty much in that period after the Royal Commission was occurring. And he said there were these cases, there were changes that were happening at the time and that they just gradually went away in the years afterwards. And the jail just went back to being, the same. And so even if there were those little changes that were being made after the Royal Commission, they went away. That was my dad's experience at the Rockhampton jail, where there was also a case that was investigated by the Royal Commission. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there hasn't been any, the large percentage, the majority of recommendations have never been implemented in states.
Yeah. The other thing that we've been, there's a lot of questions in here around Aboriginal media, and you talked about your passion in building up those things. So people are asking where they can go to for good sources of news and reporting on these kinds of things. Do you want to just talk about, some of the Black publications, or where they've got good Aboriginal journalists or writers on staff, where people might go to for good information?
I think one of the best places you can go to is community Aboriginal radio. And like a key one, like an example I say is 98.9. If you look through the archives of Let's Talk, Bo Spearham hosts it currently, but in the past, like Uncle Tiger Bells, who's passed away, you see an archive. It's phenomenal, the amount of voices that are in there talking about a breadth of issues in ways that you just do not hear in the mainstream. And then we have a lot of really talented Aboriginal journalists coming up. But I'm really just keen on independent Black media and building that up, because I think sometimes we've got a lot of really talented journos in mainstream right now, which is really great that we've got that those spaces, but you're still in a sense being confined by those news values that sometimes work against Aboriginal interests. And so I think, listening to, looking at Indigenous X, Koori Mail, 98.9 or your local community radio station, you find those voices out there. But also like following individual journalists, who are doing really good work, even, in those publications, and are working against those in their own capacity, I think is really important to draw out those differing voices, there's just so many, like Lorena Allam at The Guardian. You've got Ella Archibald Bin, she's at ABC 7:30 Report. So finding out those individual voices as well who are working even in mainstream.
Yeah. The next question is from Claudia Craig, and Claudia, I might hijack your question a bit here. She says, in relation to your point about Aboriginal people not being believed by police, that it's interesting that we are seeing more and more Aboriginal storytelling reaching the broader public through arts and community projects, which I do think is true. And I was just going to, before I get into the rest of her question there, was going to ask you about the Writer in Residence program. And I think last year in particular was a really difficult year for the arts community as a whole, I'm sure, including authors. But as someone who, doing a PhD, you're a working journalist, all those other things, how important has it been to be connected to that community and to be able to participate in things like a Writers in Residence program at the Australia Institute to really stay connected and help your work, I guess?
Oh, I think it was enormously helpful because I'm a mother as well of 2 young children. So I think during COVID period, it was just incredibly hard just to find those spaces, not just to write, but also to think. So I think just coming down to Canberra for 2 weeks really helped me do that. I think just having that space, I think sometimes, particularly like for everyone last year, it was just a struggle to be able to carve out that time. And also just, you know, a way you can think in the midst of all this anxiety in relation to what's happening in the world. So for me, it was really helpful, you know, and just to like go away for a little while and just reassess where you're going even into the new year. Yeah, I think I would encourage a lot of other people to apply.
Yeah. And so Claudia's question was, so we see more and more Aboriginal storytelling reaching the broader public, particularly through arts and community projects. Yet in real-time contexts like the incidents that you've talked about in the justice system, there doesn't seem to be that same receptiveness to hearing Aboriginal people and believing their stories. So can you come back to that idea of, you know, not being believed and not getting the benefit of the doubt, and what we as a community can be doing to really elevate and amplify and believe those stories?
I'm not sure what, I mean, I think Australia has to go through I think it's even bigger than that. I think it's just Australia has to go through this process where you go back to the heart of what actually happened, because everything that, you know, the slandering of the black voice, it all has a purpose. It's all about land at the heart of it. It's all about this uncomfortableness around how Australia began. And it's also about what, you know, you look at so many things. It's all about keeping blackfellas from land, whether it's, you know, massacring, but then moving them into reserves missions and containing us through the incarceration and justice system. You know, it's all centrally about land and our rights to land. So it comes down to the fact that we've never dealt with that original unfinished business around what happened to this country, and Australia is still very resistant for that. So I think that still bleeds into that. And also, obviously, white supremacy and racism is totally ingrained. It's how our structures are set up. It's ingrained in everything. And so I think that, you know, you don't want to believe people whose testimony goes against your own interests and whose aspirations are directly against your own aspirations about this idea of what this country is supposed to be. It's a settler colony. Like, I think we have to start calling it for what it is in every element, because it affects everything. We're a settler colony, and there was a purpose for what happened here. That was the elimination of Aboriginal mobs. So you're not going to believe us. So I think it comes down to that. So it seems like a wider question than that, but I become very cynical about, you know, I find it very cynical. I can be very cynical about that until we deal with, you know, those original issues.
I imagine that's why the Makarrata included that truth-telling. We need a process of truth-telling about our history as one of its key, I guess, invitations to the rest of Australia to be a part of that process, because, yeah, we're still pretty incapable of telling the truth about.
And we haven't even had a conversation about what that truth-telling would look like and what it would involve, because I think what happens after that is that there's still those attempts by white Australia to water it down. So you might say, okay, we'll give you that, but it's, you know, whether it's divorce from justice or cause from justice or a way to placate white guilt and move on. You know what I mean? So I think it also has to be like a very in-depth conversation in which white Australia starts listening to black Australia about what actually needs to happen in relation to truth-telling. And sometimes I don't think we're not even there yet, because if you look at even just the fact that government was so resistant to even the idea of talking about Uluru, and we never had that proper conversation about anything about Uluru, what came out of it, what mob want, what mob don't want. There was nothing. It was just totally like the oxygen was cut off straight away before we could even talk about it. So how can you listen when they're just saying we can't even talk about what this is happening, how this is going to happen, which is really where the cynicism comes from, I think.
Very understandable. And you're right, the government really just dismissed that straight away. And even things like the voice to Parliament immediately became, well, what about, we don't want that. What about?
Yeah, their tactics in which to silence it or change the narrative, and that's still ongoing. You know, it's still currently ongoing. So
yeah. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, Amy. So is there anything else that you'd like to leave the audience with, or any other issue that we think, you know, we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, I just want to say, like, if you want to support Kevin Henry, we have a GoFundMe. So if you just Google GoFundMe Kevin Henry, like, the money goes direct to him. So it's basically what we're using to support him while we get the exoneration process up, just to help him heal. And I sort of been saying, like 29 years, those are your formative years, and what happened with jailing him is, it wasn't just, all of that, the violence that come with that. It really robbed him of his potential. And what I found in this case is that people did not think that was an issue. They saw this young Aboriginal kid who grew up in Woori. Oh, he didn't have potential anyway. Well, you don't know that. He's a really phenomenal person. He's an amazing artist, but he's also just incredibly community minded. He's a pillar in so many ways for his community. And so that's what I find really upsetting, is that they robbed him of his potential. And so that's what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to help him in the years that he has. He's got a lot of years ahead of him. So if you want to support him, like Google GoFundMe, Kevin Henry, and the money goes direct to him. It doesn't go to us or anything, but that's the way you can support him, which I would really encourage everyone to do if you hear his story and you want to help out in any way.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Amy. We really appreciate all of it, and good luck with your not one but two books.
See how we go.
That's everything else we've got going. We might tell everyone when Amy's books come out, so make sure that you're subscribed to hear back from us, and don't forget to check out Amy's podcast, Curtain, as well. It started quite some time ago, but it's gripping and well worth listening to. But yeah, thank you so much again, Amy, and thanks everyone for your great questions today. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All of our webinars are free and available to view on our YouTube channel, which you can find and subscribe to at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at australiainstitute.org.au, and you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and you can find our producer Jennifer Macy at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, everyone, and thanks for listening.